Welcome to the deep dive. We take some really interesting sources, break them down, and pull out the key ideas for you.
Making sense of complex stuff.
Exactly. And today, we're diving into a pretty different way of looking at neural divergence.
Hmm.
This comes from the Abstractionist papers, which you can find online at www.welcometothe.bluespace.com.
A fascinating read, definitely.
Yeah, the core idea we want to unpack is seeing neurodivergence not as like a defect, but maybe as just natural variation.
Right. Different ways brains can be wired. And how we interpret that difference really depends on our own internal ideas, our assumptions about what's average.
And that leads to seeing the same thing as either a disorder or maybe even a strength. We'll also touch on this concept called the biological blindfold.
And how slippery the idea of illness can actually be.
Ultimately, it's about exploring this, well, maybe revolutionary thought. That diversity itself is a core, useful feature of reality.
It really challenges some fundamental assumptions. The starting point in the papers is quite deep. This idea that our feeling of being separate, me here, you there, the world out there.
That it's maybe just a concept, not the whole picture.
Exactly. The book uses this lovely analogy. Think of an eddy in a stream.
Okay.
It looks like its own thing, a separate swirl, right? But it's totally part of the stream, made of the stream. It's all connected.
So that implies we're not just observing reality, but we're kind of creating our experience of it.
That's the leap. We construct our own perceived world, an abstract version of what's out there.
Okay. This is where red space and blue space come in, right? Help us unpack that a bit.
Right. So blue space is presented as the underlying shared reality. It's where causation happens, where things interact.
The how things happen domain.
Correct. But red space, that's your personal internal universe. Your thoughts, your feelings, how you see, hear, touch, everything.
And it feels completely real to me. Like,
Yeah.
This is the world.
Exactly. It feels total. But it's entirely constructed inside your mind. So even if we're looking at the same object, my red space experience of it isn't identical to yours.
Which really throws a wrench in the idea of a single, normal way to experience things.
Absolutely, because whose red space gets to be the standard?
So how does the biological blindfold fit into this picture of us living in our own red spaces?
Well, the blindfold idea is basically that we're doubly unaware. First, we don't fully grasp how blue space, the underlying reality, actually works.
Okay, if that makes sense. It's complex.
But second, and maybe more profoundly, we often forget that the world we do experience our red space is an internal construction. We mistake our map for the territory.
We think we're seeing blue space directly.
Pretty much. We're effectively blind to the true nature of blue space and blind to the fact that our red space is just an interpretation. Now, luckily, our red space models blue space well enough most of the time.
We manage to function, yeah. Don't walk into walls too often.
Yeah, right. But that very functionality reinforces the illusion and makes us think, see, I'm perceiving reality as it is.
Okay, this is interesting. The papers suggest that moments of confusion, like paradoxes or dissonance, they're actually important. Not just mental errors.
That's a key insight. They're seen as signals, almost like error messages pointing out the limits of our current understanding.
Exit signs, the book calls them.
Exactly. Exit signs indicating where our internal models, our red space logic, might be breaking down or need updating. Think about paradoxes like the chicken and the egg.
Which came first?
Or the ship of Theseus replace every plank. Is it still the same ship? Our standard linear logic struggles with these.
Because real systems, blue space systems, aren't always linear. They're more complex, cyclical maybe.
Precisely. Nature often involves feedback loops, continuous transformation, things that defy simple A causes B thinking or fixed identities.
And our minds don't like these contradictions, do they? We try to resolve them.
We strive for coherence. That's a powerful drive. When something doesn't fit our existing mental framework, the mind works to resolve that dissonance.
And that effort, that struggle, can actually lead to new understanding, new meaning.
It can, absolutely. It forces us to find a broader perspective, a new model that can accommodate the seemingly contradictory information. That's how insight often happens.
Let's talk about interpretation versus causation. The book really emphasizes this distinction.
It's crucial. There's the domain of how things happen, that's causation, interaction in blue space. Then there's the domain of what it means to us, that's interpretation happening within our individual red spaces.
And interpretation is always internal, meaning doesn't just jump from my head to yours.
According to this framework, no. Meaning is constructed internally. We can align our interpretations through conversation, shared experience, sustained interaction.
So our red spaces become more similar.
They can synchronize, yes,
Yeah.
but they remain fundamentally separate. Each mind is its own interpreter.
Okay, and this idea of orthogonality of domains, that sounds technical. Can you make it more concrete?
Sure. Think of two axes on a graph, like x and y. They're related, they define a point together, but changing your position on the x-axis doesn't automatically change your position on the y-axis. They're independent dimensions.
Okay.
So causation, blue space interactions, and interpretation, red space meaning, are like those axes. They're linked. Our interpretations are about the causal world, but they operate independently. Changing how things happen doesn't automatically dictate one single meaning, and changing our interpretation doesn't change the underlying physics.
So what we know, what we experience, is always the interpretation, the red space construction.
Yes. We don't have direct, unfiltered access to blue space causation. Our reality emerges at that intersection point between the external causal flow and our internal interpretive framework.
Right, got it. So bringing this back to neurodivergence, how does this whole framework, red space, blue space interpretation, help us understand it differently?
This is where the concept of incoherence comes in. It's symbolized by delta.
Okay, incoherence. What does that mean here?
In the papers, incoherence describes a kind of shift, a change in how an entity relates to the usual rules or patterns of its environment, its natural space, within the causation domain, blue space. It's like operating slightly out of sync with the dominant rhythm.
And how does this incoherence arise?
It's linked to something called causal impedance. Think of impedance like resistance. When changes happen that increase an entity's causal impedance, it becomes less easily influenced or governed by the standard rules of that space. It sort of pushes back or interacts differently.
Okay, I think I see the connection. So neurodivergence could be seen as a form of this incoherence, a higher impedance to certain, say, social or cognitive norms.
That's the potential link being drawn. What one observer, using their own red space model and their idea of average, might perceive as difficulty or disorder.
Like struggling with certain social cues or focusing differently.
Right. That could, within this larger blue space context, simply be a different mode of interaction, a natural variation, an expression of this incoherence. It's not inherently wrong, just different.
And whether we label it disorder or difference or even strength depends heavily
on the observer's internal models, their red space interpretation, and the shared narratives within society about what constitutes normal functioning. The context is everything.
So maybe diversity itself, neurodiversity included, is a kind of large-scale expression of incoherence.
That's a really interesting extension of the idea. Diversity means having a range of ways of being, thinking, interacting with reality, a spectrum of different impedances, if you will.
And that variety could be useful.
The papers connect this to a concept called general selection, basically, the broad evolutionary idea that variability within a system is key for adaptation. Different ways of being mean more potential solutions when the environment changes. A particular incoherence might be disadvantageous in one context, but incredibly advantageous in another.
That makes a lot of sense. What about things like distraction or inattention, often seen purely as negatives?
Well, this framework invites us to question that automatic negative judgment. Could distraction actually be a different pattern of engagement? Maybe a wider, more diffuse focus?
Instead of a lack of focus,
Yeah.
just a different kind of focus.
Possibly. Perhaps that different pattern is better at picking up on subtle variations, inconsistencies, or, well, incoherence in the environment that a more narrowly focused mind might miss.
Connections others don't see.
Maybe. And it's quite telling that the papers explicitly state neurodivergence helped this very work.
Wow. So the author is saying their own different way of thinking was essential to developing these concepts.
It strongly implies that yes, that these insights might not have emerged from a more conventional processing style. It suggests these differences can be engines for innovation and new understanding.
Okay, pulling all these threads together. How is this perspective actually revolutionary? Why should we, care about looking at it this way?
I think it's revolutionary because it fundamentally shifts away from a deficit model. Instead of starting with what's wrong or what's missing when we encounter difference.
Like neurodivergence.
It encourages us to ask, what is the internal logic here? How does this way of being interact with the world? It reframes difference as a potentially valuable part of natural variation.
Moving away from pathologizing everything that doesn't fit a narrow band of normal.
Exactly. Especially when that normal is based on often unexamined averages constructed within our shared red space stories. It promotes understanding that there isn't just one right way to experience reality.
And recognizing our own constructed realities, our red spaces, and that others have equally valid, though different red spaces. That fosters empathy.
It has to, doesn't it? If you
Yeah.
truly grasp that someone else isn't just being difficult, but is genuinely experiencing and interpreting the world differently based on their own internal wiring and models, it opens the door for better communication, for finding ways to harmonize these different perspectives.
Okay, so let's quickly recap the journey we've taken here. We looked at neurodivergence not as defect, but natural variation, potentially linked to this blue space concept of incoherence.
Right, a different way of interacting with the causal flow.
We saw how our own internal models, our red spaces, and the biological blindfold shape whether we see difference as disorder or perhaps strength.
And how context dependent the very label of illness or disorder can be.
Then we consider diversity itself as maybe an expression of this useful incoherence, even reframing things like distraction,
Potentially seeing it as a different, maybe valuable attentional style, crucial even for the work we discuss.
leading to this potentially revolutionary shift away from deficit models towards understanding difference.
It boils down to realizing that what looks like a bug from one perspective might be a feature from another, a unique way of navigating reality and uncovering possibilities others might miss.
Which leaves us and you with a final thought to chew on. If our ideas about disorder are so tied up with our internal constructed models and imagined averages, what other things that we currently see as limitations, as problems, might actually be just natural variations? Different ways of being in the vast ocean of causation, potentially valuable in ways we haven't even considered yet.
A powerful question. And if you want to explore these ideas more deeply, the place to go is www.welcometothe bluespace.com to read the Abstractionist papers yourself.
Definitely worth checking out. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.